Good morning, everyone. Resuming History 137. Are there any questions about the syllabus or the content of the last lectures people want to raise? Very good. So I want to begin today by actually dealing with the first review question. You'll recall that the review questions are the basis of the final exam. So as we go along, I'm going to give you a sort of an overview, a précis of what I'm looking for in relationship to the successive questions that I'm asking. And of course, the final is will be a take-home at the end of term. It'll be in 3 parts. Beginning, middle, and third part, and you'll have a choice of 3 questions in each part for a total of 3 questions for the final. So the first review question I'm dealing with is the question of what is a civilization, and enumerate the civilizations that existed in 1500 when this course begins. So this recalls, of course, what we did last time. And so I say fundamental to the existence of civilization, there has to be a substantial agricultural surplus, because while the great majority of people involved in such civilizations, of course, are peasants, and they produce their own food and necessities, one of the fundamental characteristics, another fundamental characteristic of all civilizations, including our own, is that there is a class that does not live directly from production. They live off the production of the producers. And for most of history, that, of course, has been the peasants who produce the food. So in the first instance is agricultural surpluses, which enable the development of social classes, indeed antagonistic social classes. And I say that because there are the peasants on the one hand, and then there are the landlords who are associated closely with the government officials and the priests in society. And basically they live by simply making the peasants' ability to basically supply their family on the condition of the paying an additional rent or taxes, off of which the upper class, landlords, government bureaucrats, priests live. And so you have agricultural surpluses as social classes, and organizing this whole complex. You have the first states, political states, and state religions. States, of course, supply law, and also using their military, their coercive powers, they also enforce police and coerce the population. So we have agricultural surpluses, social classes, and the development of states and state religions, because within civilization, religion is more often than not associated with the state. It is a part of the state. And the priests are basically, they constitute a department of the state. And what they do is, of course, they propitiate the gods, because from the mentality of people who live in this kind of society, it's the gods, or we could say even God, who controls nature. So God, or the gods, and nature are propitiated by the priests, but they also encourage and teach the population to obey their rulers. Pay rent, pay your taxes, don't get into trouble. This is what the priests of the state religion teach. In addition to this, there do develop, really starting in the most ancient civilizations that we know about, whether it's Mesopotamia or Egypt or China and so on, towns and cities arise. And these, this is where the landlord, this is where the state administrators, this is where the temples are, this is where the monumental architectural buildings, which are another feature of these civilizations. They build temples, they build palaces, great mansions for the prestigious religious and political leaders, but also there develops in these towns and cities a whole class of artisans and merchants who basically supply, in the first instance the needs of the landlords, the priests, the state administrators, the military. They supply the furniture, they supply the textiles, they supply the shoes, they supply all of the craft manufacturing, these craftsmen, which are consumed essentially by the upper class. I've noted as well that there is a monumental architecture, but also there is writing. Writing develops very early on. Writing and even a certain use of numbers develop because writing is central to collecting taxes or collecting rents. You have to keep accounts of which peasants have paid and which peasants have not paid, what is owing. And so writing develops from a very early period. And the last feature of civilization is the legalized inequality between men and women. Whereas in earlier hunting and gathering society, obviously there was a gender division of labor in the hunting and gathering societies, and there still is. But there was a remarkably high degree of equality between men and women cooperated in many tasks. Women sometimes hunted, and men stooped and gathered wild grasses or wood or what have you. And so there was a considerable degree of equality in hunting and gathering society. Once the civilization comes along, the passage of property basically is legally vested in men. This is civilizations are patriarchal by nature, and of course, we're still living with the consequences of that. The societies that I've been mainly speaking about, of course, were based on agriculture. There did exist this upper class of landlords, and we can call these societies feudal societies. Marx, for example, called these societies feudal. But currently, the term tributary societies, or based on the tributary mode of production, that has become a more favored term because it includes both feudal rents paid to landlords and taxes as well. So that basically gives you the basic characteristics of civilization. Now, as to which civilizations existed in 1500, I briefly noted them last time, but I should note them again. Of course, European civilization, and we in particular are dealing with Western European civilization, but there was also, of course, to the east, there by 1500 that already had risen a very definitely different European civilization, namely I'm talking about Russian civilization. So Europe and this sort of Russian civilization by extension included other principalities, if you like Serbia, was close to Russia. Bulgaria was close to Russia, the Bulgarian Principality. So there is this sort of split we can see between East and West, which is still with us. I'll speak a little bit more about that in a little while. Is there any question? So that more or less sums up what the first sort of review question is all about. You tell me the basic characteristics and you list these civilizations. Oh yes, I should finish by noting, of course, that so we have Western European civilization, we have Russian civilization, we have the Ottoman Empire, which covers the whole of the Middle East and North Africa. We have Persia, the present Iran, which was sort of a cousin of Ottoman civilization, but different, particularly a different version of religion. And then we have Indian civilization, and In addition to that, we have Chinese civilization and Japanese civilization. And we should also include, of course, and we will be discussing the civilizations of the New World, notably the Aztecs and the Incas. And finally, in Africa, we have civilized communities, including Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, Mali, and Kilwa. We see on all of the continents, I guess we would have to exclude the Arctic and Australia. There were already civilized societies by 1500. Are there any questions about what I've said? Okay, very good. Okay, now when we survey all of this, we find that if we sort of, it's possible to do this, population experts or demographers, as we call them, have estimated that the world's population in 1500 was 800 million people. Today, the world's population is 10 times greater than that. That is to say, there are 8 billion people on this earth. Back then, there were 800 million. Now, of these 800 million, 500 million of them lived in civilization. And civilizations, the civilizations that I've listed, occupied 1/4 of the landmass of the world. So we have, to repeat, around 1500, there were 800 million people on Earth. 500 million of them lived in civilized communities. They occupied 25% of the landmass of the world. Now, I would say about all of this, and in particular, it has to do with the civilizations that occupied the landmass of Eurasia. Hopefully, I can manipulate this and get a search going. Okay. Okay, here's a map of Eurasia. It's actually quite convenient. Of course, Africa's down here. This whole landmass is Eurasia, obviously, and you see there's China, there's India, there's Russia, and there's Europe here. What we can say about this whole Africa had some contact with Eurasia, but the contacts in general before 1500 were limited. I'm saying the cultural and commercial contacts between the different parts of Eurasia were limited prior to 1500. That being said, there were contacts. Chinese had contacts with Europe and vice versa. Certainly Russia had contacts with China and Western Europe. India had its contacts with the Middle East and so on. There were contacts, but they were quite limited. There was no regular world trade on a real scale. There had been really some trade since the ancient world, but it was limited. And a lot of it has to do with the difficulties of transport and so on. But what we can say overall, whatever contact there was an essential equilibrium between the different parts of Eurasia. Each civilization was developing largely in isolation, and there was a kind of rough equilibrium between the different parts. And not to speak of Africa, that's true. And of course, we can say that the Americas, North and South America, were basically unknown. Their real contact starts with Columbus in 1492. I know that there was some contact before that, but it was not steady and continuous. So that's the essential picture in 1500 as between these different civilizations. Now, I want in particular now to look at Western Europe. In 1500. I'm trying to give you basically an introduction a geographic introduction to the subject. And so let's look at this map. It's not that great. This is probably better. Yes, clearer. When we look at Western Europe in 1500, first of all, we should say that we talk about the term, we use the term Europe, but where did that term come from? Well, it comes from the Greek, and as a matter of fact, if we go back to a Greek historian of the 5th century BC by the name of Herodotus. He was the first person to use the term Europe with respect to what we're today familiar with as Europe. However, what we need to realize is that when we look at Europe as such as it was in 1500, the term Europe was certainly used and understood, especially by scholars. But the more frequent term that was used with respect to Europe was the term Christian Commonwealth, the Christian Commonwealth. Or to use the Latin term, which is the equivalent to Christian Commonwealth, the Respublica, which means Commonwealth, Christiana, the Christian Commonwealth, was the way Europe was generally referred to in 1500, especially Western Europe. And why was that? Because most people who had some sense of these things, the educated, etc., they understood that basically Europe, Western Europe, was a single entity. Yes, there were states emerging, and we'll see that, France, England, etc. But still, stemming from the Middle Ages, the basic view was, in fact, Europe is a unity, and that unity is based on the fact that all Europeans, except for certain marginal elements, practice the same religion, namely Christianity, and in particular, Catholic Christianity, as basically established by the Roman Church, by the papacy, by Rome. All of Western Europe was conceived in this way in 1500. So it's the Christian Commonwealth. And as a matter of fact, I've spoken about the fact that there was this distinct Eastern European society focused on Russia, on Moscow, and the essential difference between this Eastern entity, Russia and Serbia, Balkans, and so on, and the West was the religious difference. All of the Western European states were loyal to Rome, but the Russian state and its associated states were not. They considered themselves Orthodox, and so we have this basic distinction. They did not accept the authority of the Roman popes and considered themselves to be Orthodox, and they looked, as a matter of fact, to the Greek Orthodox Church, whose headquarters was down in Constantinople and so on. There was this fundamental religious divide, which has persisted to this day, and is the basis of the sort of the cultural and, of course, political differences between Eastern Europe, particularly Russia, and the West, which has persisted to the present. And so we could say that some states, if we look at, say, Poland, which is here, or Hungary, which is here, or Austria, which is here, they're all Roman Catholic. And to the east lies Russia. And there's this sort of basic, if you like, antagonism. And of course, one of the places where this separation is most acutely felt is the Ukraine, of all places, because Eastern Ukraine is Orthodox, identifies with Russia, and Western Ukraine tends to be Catholic and identifies with Rome in the West. And so there you are in terms of sort of, it doesn't even begin to explain the contemporary conflict in the Ukraine and so on and Russia. But we have to bear this in mind because it does play into the history of this region. Are there any questions about what I've said up to this point? Okay. Now, I would say, so just to sort of give you a brief survey, look, already we see what we recognize as the big states of Europe are have emerged by 1500. France, England, Spain, Portugal. We have here centralized monarchies, which are the progenitors of these modern states. But we also have an entity like Italy, which is extremely rich. It's the richest country in Europe in 1500. It's divided. It's not uniform. And likewise, to the north, we have Germany, or as it was known in those days, the Holy Roman Empire. And this too was a divided state. It was divided up into many smaller principalities, like Italy. So on the one hand, we have already to the west, Spain, Portugal, France, England, that are united monarchies. And then these other two main states, Germany and Italy, no, they're decentralized and we're going to remain decentralized. Then we have other entities. We have Austria, we have Poland, we have the Kingdom of Denmark, the Kingdom of Sweden. I'm just sort of rounding out the picture for you. So that's Western Europe. We can say that still politically, still religiously, there was a unity based on the adherence to the Catholic Church, but already these political differences were important. And Western Europe was already politically divided. In fact, these countries were more often than not at war with one another. So that is the reality. Now, that's what Western Europe, to begin with, looked like in 1500. Now, how did it compare to other civilizations that we know of? Well, if we look at European population, if we look at the European economy, if we look at even the sort of dynamism of its religion, Catholicism, we would have to say that Western Europe, still in 1500, is very peripheral. In terms of Eurasia, Western Europe is the end of the earth. It's the last stop. The civilizations that are at the center of things, in the first place, the Ottoman Empire, India, and China are the largest states. They have the largest populations. They have the largest economies. And as we'll see, in terms of religiosity, it is Islam rather than Christianity, which is really the most dynamic religion in 1500. So sort of come back to what I said at the very beginning, it is the development of capitalism, eventually industrial capitalism, and the associated military superiority that develops in Western Europe, which eventually makes it possible for the West Europeans to overthrow the equilibrium that I've been speaking about, and eventually, step by step, from the 16th century to the 17th century, and finally into the 18th and early 19th century, to basically overthrow this equilibrium and to come to dominate politically, militarily, and economically all of the civilizations of the world. Now, so that's the way it was in 1500. I want to talk a little bit more about this kind of comparison between, it's a way of sort of deepening our sort of analysis. um, comparing Western Europe with some of the other civilizations. As I said, Western Europe was politically divided, but also was dwarfed by the Ottoman Empire was enormous, that dominated the whole of the Middle East and North Africa, was dominated by a sort of unitary Islamic empire, the Ottoman Empire. And so from a political point of view, Western Europe was dwarfed. Likewise, China was an enormous unified empire at the beginning of the 16th century. And Europe could not compare with it. Now, to come to the matter of religion. Well, as I've explained, Western Europe in 1500, still the Roman Catholic Church, everybody had to belong to the Roman Catholic Church on pain of persecution. However, and furthermore, the Roman Catholic Church, especially by virtue of its alliance with Spain and Portugal, conquered all of Latin America. And so all of the peoples of Latin America, the Aztecs and the Incas, but also the Maya and many, many other peoples who lived in Latin America, basically were converted, whether they liked it or not, to the Roman Catholic religion, which has remained the dominant religion in Latin America. So that's true. And of course, the conquest of Latin America was a major gain for the Roman Catholic Church. But what has to be realized, of course, that within 20 years, 30 years, that is to say around 1530, 1540, while the Roman Catholic Church gained ascendancy in Latin America, it lost the northern half of Europe to Protestantism. There was a gigantic Protestant revolt that began in 1517 in Germany and soon spread to most of the countries in the northern part of Europe, Scandinavia, Germany, the Netherlands, England. They basically seceded from the Roman Catholic Church. They, of course, remained Christians, but now they were Protestants, Protestants, protesting against the rule of the Roman Church, the Pope, and so on. So Roman Catholicism experienced both gain and loss in the 16th century. Now, the really dynamic religion that we see in 1500 and thereabouts was Islam, because I've already mentioned the whole of the Ottoman Empire was a new state. It had been newly unified against by the Ottomans, who now ruled from what had been Constantinople. And they conquered and came to control most of what we call the Middle East and North Africa. It was an enormous state. And right next to it was Persia, another Islamic state, another Islamic empire. Furthermore, the Muslims had only recently reconsolidated their control over India, most of India, 2/3 of it. The ruling elite coming in from Afghanistan constituted the new rulers over India, who were known as the Mughals. So we see that Islam was on the march. They had the Ottoman Empire, the Persian Empire, The Mughals ruled over India. Of course, most of the Indians were Hindus, but they were the underclass at this point. Further, that was not the full extent of the influence of Islam, because down the east and west coast of Africa, merchants during the late Middle Ages and into the 16th century, coming from the Middle East, had essentially converted, not by any means all of the population in West Africa and on the coast of West Africa and East Africa, but a significant part of the population had converted to Islam as well. And then finally, the influence of Islam extended into the peoples living in southern Burma, in the southern Philippines, and Indonesia, all converted to Islam. In fact, Indonesia, which is an enormous country with over 200 million people, this is an Islamic state. So we can say that the religious and cultural influence of Islam was enormous in the 16th century. Now, in terms of sort of understanding this, who primarily was interested in this religion? Well, of course, the religious experts, the imams, the priests of Islam, and so on, of course, directed the religion. But as a matter of fact, the two groups that mainly supported this religion were the landlord class and the merchants who lived in the Middle East, who lived in Persia, who lived in many of the cities in India and beyond, in the Philippines and Indonesia. It was the landlords and merchants who were attracted to Islam. And it was very important because the cultural and religious unity of this enormous area covering so much of the Eurasian continent was unified culturally and religiously by the Islamic religion. And that made possible the creation of what we can describe as a common market, open market. The merchants from North Africa freely moved through the Middle East as far as India and back and forth. There was this constant exchange, cultural, religious, and significantly economic, commercial. And so you can see how important Islam was in 1500. Now, having said that, we started out with Western Europe. We now have looked a little bit at the Islamic cultural and economic area, and the Ottoman Empire of Persia and the Mughals in India. We have to note that the world economy in 1500 was still in equilibrium. But if we can say which of these civilizations was the most potent culturally and from an economic point of view, we would have to say it was China, which already was, I said that Chinese civilization was born around 2200 BC. It has a continuous history from 2200 BC right down to 1500, indeed, right down to the present. And it was a unified state. It had enormous cultural influence, especially in Asia. And the products that were produced in the Chinese economy, its silks, its porcelain, its later on its tea, were the most prized all over the world. In other words, Chinese products were considered the most luxurious, the most elegant, the most desirable commodities possible, porcelains as well. And therefore, we can say that insofar as there was flows of money, really in the form of gold and silver, it tended to drift towards China. China was, as I say, we can't speak in 1500. It's going to happen in a few decades, but in 1500, there was no sort of unified world market. That's one of the spectacular achievements of the 16th century. But at the beginning of this, China was at the center. And furthermore, China had already shown itself to be highly inventive. During the preceding centuries, the Chinese had discovered the magnet, they had discovered printing, and they had discovered gunpowder. And these inventions, very important, had disseminated from China across all of Eurasia, including Europe. I would say another distinctive feature of China was, unlike Europe and unlike the Middle East or India, religion did not play a political role in Chinese, in terms of Chinese politics, in terms of the Chinese Empire. Now, once upon a time, that is to say in the earlier Middle Ages, Buddhism, which was still very popular in China, there had been a certain influence of Buddhism over the Chinese state. But that was all in the past. By 1500, there was a clear separation. The Chinese state kept religion, and Buddhism was the main one, but there was another, Taoism and so on, and some other minor religions, Taoism. There was a clear separation between church and state that did not exist in Europe or in the Middle East. And so we would, that has to, a point has to be made. Now, another point I want to make that should be noted is gunpowder, the use of cannon, the use of rifles. These are all new inventions. Round about 1450, they were new. The Chinese had certainly developed the gunpowder, and they used it in warfare, but it was the Europeans who basically began to develop rifles, pistols, and cannons round about 1450. But we should note that in the course of the 16th century, all of the Asian empires, the Mughal Empire, the Ottomans in the Middle East, China, Japan, they all developed, partly helped by European craftsmen. It was in Germany that we can say that the armaments industry really developed in the 16th century. Well, the Europeans became, because they were fighting themselves all the time, one another, they developed technologically cannon, rifles, pistols to an extraordinary extent. But these were all disseminated to the Ottoman Empire, to the Mughal rulers in India, to Japan, to China. And so historians refer to all of these empires of the early modern period as gunpowder empires. The armies of all of these empires were equipped with cannon, rifles, what have you. This was already part of not simply European culture, but of the world civilization as a whole, obviously to its partly to its detriment. So that gives you a sort of an overall view I want to say a few now additional points before we close off. Any questions about at this point about what I've said? Any matters that you want clarified that I can sort of elucidate further for you before we press on? Now, one wants to say furthermore that to sort of still take an overview of the sort of process by which the Europeans became ascendant over the rest of the world. Well, it was a gradual process. It was a step-by-step process. It didn't happen overnight. By 1800, as I've explained, the Europeans had become ascendant. And in the course of the 19th century, they were actually going to politically subject all of the other civilizations. The whole of the global South would be subject to the Europeans, and of course, by extension, to the United States. But this was a gradual process. And what we can say is that the first step occurred in the 16th century. And the first step was the conquest of Latin America. The Spaniards and the Portuguese invaded and brutally conquered the peoples of Latin America. And they basically took over the political structures that the indigenous peoples had created, and the Portuguese and the Spaniards created an empire. Why did they? Why were they so interested in Latin America? Why did they seize hold of Latin America in this brutal way? For the gold and the silver. Gold and silver. It turned out that Mexico and Peru in particular had vast amounts of gold and silver. And this gold and silver, which was used for decoration by the indigenous peoples of Latin America, became the basis of what we can describe as capitalist world money. And without capitalist world money, there cannot be a capitalist world economy. So that was the essential reason why the Spanish and the Portuguese invaded and quickly took over Latin America. The second aspect of this is that at the same time, the Europeans, in order to provide themselves with a workforce to work in Latin America, because it turned out that the indigenous people were killed off in large measure, they at the same time, from the 16th century onwards, began to import African slaves in their millions. And they created this sort of New World plantation economy based on this African labor force. Between 1500 and 1800, some 20 million Africans were basically transported as slave workforce to the New World. We will end at this point and resume the discussion on Wednesday.